Chapter 3 Greeting and Farewell. Charlie Sloane, Gilbert Blythe, and Anne Shirley left Avonlea the following Monday morning. Anne had hoped for a fine day. Diana was to drive her to the station, and they wanted this, their last drive together for some time, to be a pleasant one. But when Anne went to bed Sunday night, the east wind was moaning around Green Gables with an ominous prophecy which was fulfilled in the morning. Anne awoke to find raindrops pattering against her window and shadowing the pond's gray surface with widening rings. Hills and sea were hidden in mist, and the whole world seemed dim and dreary. Anne dressed in the cheerless gray dawn, for an early start was necessary to catch the boat train. She struggled against the tears that would well up in her eyes in spite of herself. She was leaving the home that was so dear to her, and something told her that she was leaving it forever, save as a holiday refuge. Things would never be the same again. Coming back for vacations would not be living there, and oh, how dear and beloved everything was. That little white porch room, sacred to the dreams of girlhood, the old snow queen at the window, the brook in the hollow, the Dryad's bubble, the haunted wood, and Lover's Lane, all the 1,001 dear spots where memories of the old years bided. Could she ever be really happy anywhere else? Breakfast at Green Gables that morning was a rather doleful meal. Davy, for the first time in his life, probably, could not eat, but blubbered shamelessly over his porridge. Nobody else seemed to have much appetite save Dora, who tucked away her rations comfortably. Dora, like the immortal and most prudent Charlotte, who went on cutting bread and butter when her frenzied lover's body had been carried past on a shutter, was one of those fortunate creatures who are seldom disturbed by anything. Even at 8, it took a great deal to ruffle Dora's placidity. She was sorry Anne was going away, of course, but was that any reason why she should fail to appreciate a poached egg on toast? Not at all, and seeing that Davy could not eat his, Dora ate it for him. Promptly on time, Diana appeared with horse and buggy, her rosy face glowing above her raincoat. The goodbyes had to be said then somehow. Mrs. Lynde came in from her quarters to give Anne a hearty embrace and warn her to be careful of her health. Whatever she did, Marilla, brusque and tearless, pecked Anne's cheek, and she said she supposed they'd hear from her when she got settled. A casual observer might have concluded that Anne's going mattered very little to her, unless that observer had happened to get a good look in her eyes. Dora kissed Anne primly and squeezed out 2 decorous little tears, but Davy, who had been crying on the back porch step ever since they rose from the table, refused to say goodbye at all. When he saw Anne coming towards him, he sprang to his feet, bolted up the back stairs, and hid in a clothes closet, out of which he would not come. His muffled howls were the last sounds Anne heard as she left Green Gables. It rained heavily all the way to Bright River, to which station they had had to go, since the branch line train from Carmody did not connect with the boat train. Charlie and Gilbert were on the station platform when they reached it, and the train was whistling. Anne had just time to get her ticket and trunk check, say a hurried farewell to Diana, and hasten on board. She wished she were going back with Diana to Avonlea. She knew she was going to die of homesickness, and oh, if only that dismal rain would stop pouring down as if the whole world were weeping over summer vanished and joys departed. Even Gilbert's presence brought her no comfort, for Charlie Sloane was there too, and Sloanishness could be tolerated only in fine weather. It was absolutely insufferable in rain. But when the boat steamed out of Charlottetown harbor, things took a turn for the better. The rain ceased, and the sun began to burst out goldenly now and again between the rents in the clouds, burnishing the gray seas with copper-hued radiance and lighting up the mists that curtained the island's red shores, with gleams of gold foretokening a fine day after all. Besides, Charlie Sloane promptly became so seasick that he had to go below, and Anne and Gilbert were left alone on deck. I'm very glad that all the Sloanes get seasick as soon as they go on water, thought Anne mercilessly. I'm sure I couldn't take my farewell look at the old sod, with Charlie standing there pretending to look sentimentally at it too. Well, we're off, remarked Gilbert unsentimentally. Yes, I feel like Byron's Childe Harold, only it isn't really my native shore that I'm watching, said Anne, winking her gray eyes vigorously. Nova Scotia is that, I suppose, but one's native shore is the land one loves the best, and that's good old PEI for me. I can't believe I didn't always live here. Those 11 years before I came seemed like a bad dream. It's 7 years since I crossed on this boat, the evening Mrs. Spencer brought me over from Hopetown. I can see myself in that dreadful old wincey dress and faded sailor hat, exploring decks and cabins with enraptured curiosity. It was a fine evening, and how those red island shores did gleam in the sunshine. Now I'm crossing the strait again. Oh, Gilbert, I do hope I'll like Redmond and Kingsport. I'm sure I won't. Where's all your philosophy gone, Anne? It's all submerged under a great swamping wave of loneliness and homesickness. I've longed for 3 years to go to Redmond, and now I'm going, and I wish I weren't. Never mind, I shall be cheerful and philosophical again after I've just had one good cry. I must have that as a Went, and I'll have to wait until I get into my boarding house bed tonight, wherever it may be, before I can have it. Then Anne will be herself again. I wonder if Davy has come out of the closet yet. It was 9 that night when their train reached Kingsport, and they found themselves in the blue-white glare of the crowded station. Anne felt horribly bewildered, but a moment later she was seized by Priscilla Grant, who had come to Kingsport on Saturday. "Here you are, beloved, and I suppose you're as tired as I was when I got here Saturday night." "Tired, Priscilla, don't talk of it. I'm tired and green and provincial, and only about 10 years old. For pity's sake, take your poor broken-down chum to some place where she can hear herself think." "I'll take you right up to our boarding house. I've a cab ready outside." "It's such a blessing you're here, Prissy. If you weren't, I think I should just sit down on my suitcase here and now and weep bitter tears. What a comfort one familiar face is in a howling wilderness of strangers." "Is that Gilbert Blythe over there, Anne? How he's grown up this last year. He was only a schoolboy when I taught in Carmody, and of course that's Charlie Sloane. Well, he hasn't changed. Couldn't. He looked just like that when he was born, and he'll look like that when he's 80. This way, dear. We'll be home in 20 minutes. "Home," groaned Anne. "You mean we'll be in some horrible boarding house in a still more horrible hall bedroom, looking out on a dingy backyard." "It isn't a horrible boarding house, Anne girl. Here's our cab. Hop in. The driver will get your trunk. Oh yes, the boarding house. It's really a very nice place of its kind, as you'll admit tomorrow morning when a good night's sleep has turned your blues rosy pink. It's a big old-fashioned gray stone house on St. John Street, just a nice little constitutional from Redmond. It used to be the residence of great folk, but fashion has deserted St. John Street, and its houses only dream now of better days. They're so big that the people living in them have to take boarders just to fill it up. At least, that is the reason our landladies are very anxious to impress on us. They're delicious, Anne. Our landladies, I mean." "How many are there?" "2. Miss Hannah Harvey and Miss Ada Harvey. They were born twins about 50 years ago." "I can't get away from twins, it seems," smiled Anne. "Wherever I go, they confront me." "Oh, they're not twins now, dear. After they reached the age of 30, they were never twins again. Miss Hannah has grown old, not too gracefully, and Miss Ada has stayed 30, less gracefully still. I don't know whether Miss Hannah can smile or not. I've never caught her at it so far, but Miss Ada smiles all the time, and that's worse. However, they're nice, kind souls, and they take 2 boarders every year because Miss Hannah's economical soul cannot bear to waste room space, not because they need or have to, as Miss Ada has told me 7 times since Saturday night. As for our rooms, I'll admit they are hall bedrooms, and mine does look out on the backyard. Your room is a front one and looks out on Old St. John's graveyard, which is just across the street." "That sounds gruesome," shivered Anne. "I think I'd rather have the backyard view." "Oh, no, he wouldn't. Wait and see. Old St. John's is a darling place. It's been a graveyard so long that it ceased to be one and has become one of the sights of Kingsport. Excuse me. I was all through it yesterday for a pleasure exertion. There's a big stone wall and a row of enormous trees all around it, and rows of trees all through it, and the queerest old tombstones with the queerest and quaintest inscriptions. You'll go there to study, Anne. See if you don't. Of course nobody's ever buried there now, but a few years ago they put on a beautiful monument in the memory of Nova Scotian soldiers who fell in the Crimean War. It is just opposite the entrance gates, and there's scope for imagination in it, as you used to say. Here's your trunk at last, and the boy's coming to say goodnight. Must I really shake hands with Charlie Sloane, Anne? His hands are always so cold and fishy-feeling. We must ask them to call occasionally. Miss Hannah gravely told me we could have young gentlemen callers 2 evenings in the week if they went away at a reasonable hour. And Miss Ada asked me, smiling, please, to be sure they didn't sit on her beautiful cushions. I promised to see to it, but goodness knows where else they can sit unless they sit on the floor, for there are cushions on everything. Miss Ada even has an elaborate Battenberg one on top of the piano. Anne was laughing by this time. Priscilla's gay chatter had the intended effect of cheering her up. Homesickness vanished for the time being, and did not even return in full force when she finally found herself alone in her little bedroom. She went to her window and looked out. The street below was dim and quiet. Across it the moon was shining above the trees in Old St. John's, just behind the great dark head of the lion on the monument. Anne wondered if it could have been only that morning that she had left Green Gables. She had the sense of a long passage of time, which one day had of change and travel gives. I suppose that very same moon is looking down on Green Gables now, she mused. But I won't think about it. That way homesickness lies. I'm not even going to have my good cry. I'll put that off to a more convenient season, and just now I'll go calmly and sensibly to bed and to sleep. Chapter 4. April's Lady. Kingsport is a quaint old town, harkening back to early colonial days, and wrapped in its ancient atmosphere as some fine old dame in garments fashioned like those of her youth. Here and there it sprouts out in modernity, but at heart it is still unspoiled. It is full of curious relics, and haloed by the romance of many legends of the past. Once it was a mere frontier station on the fringe of the wilderness, and those were the days when Indians kept life from being monotonous to the settlers. Then it grew to be a bone of contention between the British and the French, being occupied now by the one and now by the other, emerging from each occupation with some fresh scar of battling nations branded on it. It has in its park Martello Tower, autographed all over by tourists, a dismantled old French fort on the hills beyond the town, and several antiquated cannons in its public squares. It has other historic spots also, which may be hunted out by the curious, and none is more quaint and delightful than Old St. John's Cemetery, at the very core of the town, with streets of quiet, old-time houses on two sides, and busy, bustling modern thoroughfares on the others. Every citizen of Kingsport feels a thrill of possessive pride in Old St. John's, for if he be of any pretensions at all, he has an ancestor buried there, with a queer crooked slab at his head, or else sprawling protectively over the grave on which all the main facts of his history are recorded. For the most part, no great art or skill was lavished on those old tombstones. The larger number are of roughly chiseled brown or gray native stone, and only in a few cases is there any attempt at ornamentation. Some are adorned with skull and crossbones, and this grisly decoration is frequently coupled with a cherub's head. Many are prostrate in ruins, and to almost all time's tooth has been gnawing, until some inscriptions have been completely effaced, and others can only be deciphered with difficulty. The graveyard is very full and very bowery, for it is surrounded and intersected by rows of elms and willows, beneath whose shade the sleepers must lie very dreamlessly, forever crooned to by the winds and leaves over them, and quite undisturbed by the clamor of traffic just beyond. Anne took the first of many rambles in Old St. John's the next afternoon. She and Priscilla had gone to Redmond in the forenoon and registered as students, after which there was nothing more to do that day. The girls gladly made their escape, for it was not exhilarating to be surrounded by crowds of strangers, most of whom had rather alien appearances, as if not quite sure where they belonged. The freshettes stood about in detached groups of 2 or 3, looking askance at each other. The freshies, wiser in their day and generation, had banded themselves together on the big staircase of the entrance hall, where they were shouting out glees with all the vigor of youthful lungs, as a species of defiance to their traditional enemies, the sophomores, a few of whom were prowling loftily about, looking properly disdainful of the unlicked cubs on the stairs. Gilbert and Charlie were nowhere to be seen. Little did I think the day would ever come when I'd be glad of the sight of a Sloane, said Priscilla, as they crossed the campus. But I'd welcome Charlie's goggle eyes almost ecstatically. At least they'd be familiar. Oh, sighed Anne. I can't describe how I felt when I was standing there, waiting my turn to be registered, as insignificant as the teeniest drop in a most enormous bucket. It's bad enough to feel insignificant, but it is unbearable to have it grained into your soul that you will never, can never be anything but insignificant, and that is how I did feel, as if I were invisible to the naked eye, and some of those sophs might step on me. I knew I would go down to my grave unwept, unhonored, and unsung. Wait till next year, comforted Priscilla. Then we'll be able to look as bored and sophisticated as any sophomore of them all. No doubt it was rather dreadful to feel insignificant, but I think it's better than to feel as big and awkward as I did, as if I were sprawled all over Redmond. That's how I felt, I suppose because I was a good 2 inches taller than anyone else in the crowd. I wasn't afraid a soph might walk over to me. I was afraid they'd take me for an elephant or an overgrown sample of a potato-fed islander. I suppose the trouble is we can't forgive Big Redmond for not being little queens, said Anne, gathering about her the shreds of her old cheerful philosophy to cover her nakedness of spirit. When we left Queens, we knew everybody and had a place of our own. I suppose we have been unconsciously expecting to take life up at Redmond just where we left off at Queens, and now we feel as if the ground had slipped from under our feet. I'm thankful that neither Mrs. Lynde nor Miss Elisha Wright know, or ever will know, my state of mind at present. They would exult in saying, I told you so, and be convinced it was the beginning of the end, whereas it is just the end of the beginning. Exactly. That sounds more Annish. In a little while we'll be acclimated and acquainted, and all will be well. And did you notice the girl who stood alone just outside the door of the co-ed's dressing room all the morning? The pretty one with the brown eyes and crooked mouth. Yes, I did. I noticed her particularly because she seemed the only creature there who looked as lonely and friendless as I had felt. I had you, but she had no one. I think she felt pretty all by herselfish, too. Several times I saw her make a motion as if to cross over to us, but she never did it. Too shy, I suppose. I wish she would come. If I hadn't felt so much like the aforesaid elephant, I'd have gone to her, but I couldn't lumber across that big hall with all those boys howling on the stairs. She was the prettiest freshette I saw today, but probably favor is deceitful, and even beauty is vain on your first day at Redmond, concluded Priscilla with a laugh. I'm going across to Old St. John's after lunch, said Anne. I don't know that a graveyard is a very good place to go to get cheered up, but it seems the only get-able place where there are trees, and trees I must have. I'll sit on one of those old slabs and shut my eyes and imagine I'm in the Avonlea woods. Anne did not do that, however, for she found enough of interest in Old St. John's to keep her eyes wide open. They went in by the entrance gates, past the simple massive stone arch surmounted by the great Lion of England. And on Inkerman yet the wild bramble is gory, and those bleak heights henceforth shall be famous in story, quoted Anne, looking at it with a thrill. They found themselves in a dim, cool, green place, where winds were fond of purring. Up and down the long grassy aisles they wandered, reading the quaint, voluminous epitaphs carved in an age that had more leisure than our own. Here lieth the body of Albert Crawford, Esquire, read Anne from a worn grey slab. For many years, keeper of His Majesty's ordnance at Kingsport, he served in the army till the peace of 1763, when he retired from bad health. He was a brave officer, the best of husbands, the best of fathers, the best of friends. He died October 29th, 1792, aged 84 years. There's an epitaph for you, Prissy. There is certainly some scope for imagination in it. How full such a life must have been of adventure, and as for his personal qualities, I'm sure human eulogy couldn't go further. I wonder if they told him he was all those best things while he was alive. Oh, here's another, said Priscilla. Listen. To the memory of Alexander Ross, who died on the 22nd of September, 1840, aged 43 years. This is raised as a tribute of affection by one whom he served so faithfully for 27 years that he was regarded as a friend deserving the fullest confidence and attachment. Very good epitaph, commented Anne thoughtfully. I wouldn't wish a better. We are all servants of some sort, and if the fact that we are faithful can be truthfully inscribed on our tombstones, nothing more need be added. Oh, here's a sorrowful little grey stone, Prissy. To the memory of a favorite child. And here is another, erected to the memory of one who's buried elsewhere. I wonder where that unknown grave is. Really, Pris, the graveyards of today will never be as interesting as this. You were right. I shall come here often. I love it already. I see we're not alone here. There's a girl down at the end of this avenue. Yes, and I believe it's the very girl we saw at Redmond this morning. I've been watching her for 5 minutes. She has started to come up the avenue exactly half a dozen times, and half a dozen times has she turned and gone back. Either she's dreadfully shy, or she's got something on her conscience. Let's go and meet her. It's easier to get acquainted in a graveyard than at Redmond, I believe. They walked down the long grassy arcade towards the stranger, who was sitting on a grey slab under an enormous willow. She was certainly very pretty, with a vivid, irregular, bewitching type of prettiness. There was a gloss as of brown nuts on her satin-smooth hair, and a soft, ripe glow on her round cheeks. Her eyes were big and brown and velvety, under oddly pointed black brows, and her crooked mouth was rose red. She wore a smart brown suit with 2 very modish little shoes peeping from beneath it, and her hat of dull pink straw wreathed with golden brown poppies had the indefinable, unmistakable air which pertained to the creation of an artist in millinery. Priscilla had a sudden stinging consciousness that her own hat had been trimmed by her village store milliner, and Anne wondered uncomfortably if the blouse she had made herself, and which Mrs. Lynde had fitted, looked very countrified and homemade beside the stranger's smart attire. For a moment, both girls felt the turning back. But they had already stopped and turned towards the grey slab. It was too late to retreat, for the brown-eyed girl had evidently concluded that they were coming to speak to her. Instantly she sprang up and came forward with outstretched hand and a gay, friendly smile, in which there seemed not a shadow of either shyness or burdened consciousness. "Oh, I want to know who you 2 girls are," she exclaimed eagerly. "I've been dying to know. I saw you at Redmond this morning. Say, wasn't it awful there? For the time I wish I had stayed home and got married." Anne and Priscilla both broke into unconstrained laughter at this unexpected conclusion. The brown-eyed girl laughed too. "I really did. I could have, you know. Come, let's all sit down on this gravestone and get acquainted. It won't be hard. I know we're going to adore each other. I knew it as soon as I saw you at Redmond this morning. I wanted so much to go right over and hug you both." "Why didn't you?" asked Priscilla. "Because I simply couldn't make up my mind to do it. I never can make up my mind about anything myself. I'm always afflicted with indecision. Just as soon as I decided to do something, I feel in my bones that another course would be the correct one. It's a dreadful misfortune, but I was born that way, and there's no use in blaming me for it, as some people do. So, I couldn't make up my mind to go and speak to you, much as I wanted to." "We thought you were too shy," said Anne. No, no, dear. Shyness isn't among the many failings or virtues of Philippa Gordon. Phil for short. Do call me Phil right off. Now, what are your handles?" "She's Priscilla Grant," said Anne, pointing, "and she's Anne Shirley," said Priscilla, pointing in turn. "And we're from the island," said both together. "I hail from Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia," said Philippa. "Bolingbroke!" exclaimed Anne. "Why, that is where I was born." "Do you really mean it? Why, that makes you a blue nose after all." "No, it doesn't," retorted Anne. "Wasn't it Dan O'Connell who said that if a man was born in a stable, it didn't make him a horse? I'm island to the core." "Well, I'm glad you were born in Bolingbroke anyway. It makes us kind of neighbors, doesn't it? And I like that, because when I tell you secrets, it won't be as if I were telling them to a stranger. I have to tell them. I can't keep secrets. It's no use to try. That's my worst failing, that, and indecision, as aforesaid. Would you believe it? It took me half an hour to decide what hat to wear when I was coming here. Here, to a graveyard. At first I inclined to my brown one with the feather, but as soon as I put it on, I thought this pink one with the floppy brim would be more becoming. When I got it pinned in place, I liked the brown one better. At last I put them close together on the bed, shut my eyes, and jabbed with a hat pin. The pin speared the pink one, so I put it on. It is becoming, isn't it? Tell me, what do you think of my looks?" At this naive demand, made in a particularly serious tone, Priscilla laughed again, but Anne said impulsively, squeezing Philippa's hand, "We thought this morning that you were the prettiest girl we saw at Redmond." Philippa's crooked mouth flashed into a bewitching crooked smile over very little white teeth. "I thought that myself," was her next astounding statement, "but I wanted someone else's opinion to bolster mine up. I can't decide, even on my own appearance. Just as soon as I've decided that I'm pretty, I begin to feel miserably that I'm not. Besides, I have a horrible old great aunt who's always saying to me with a mournful sigh, 'You were such a pretty baby. It's strange how children change when they grow up.' I adore aunts, but I detest great aunts. Please tell me quite often that I am pretty if you don't mind. I feel so much more comfortable when I can believe I'm pretty, and I'll be just as obliging to you if you want me to. I can be, with a clear conscience." "Thanks," laughed Anne. "But Priscilla and I are so firmly convinced of our own good looks that we don't need any assurance about them. So you needn't trouble." "Oh, you're laughing at me. I know you think I'm abominably vain, but I'm not. There really isn't one spark of vanity in me, and I'm never a bit grudging about paying compliments to other girls when they deserve them. I'm so glad I know you folks. I came up on Saturday, and I've nearly died of homesickness ever since. It's a horrible feeling, isn't it? In Bolingbroke, I'm an important personage, and in Kingsport, I'm just nobody. There were times when I could feel my soul turning a delicate blue. Where do you hang out?" 38 St. John Street. Better and better. Why, I'm just around the corner on Wallace Street. I don't like my boarding house, though. It's bleak and lonesome, and my room looks out on such an unholy backyard. It's the ugliest place in the world. As for cats, well, surely all the Kingsport cats can't congregate there at night, but half of them must. I adore cats on hearth rugs, snoozing before nice friendly fires, but cats in backyards at midnight are totally different animals. The first night I was here, I cried all night, and so did the cats. You should have seen my nose in the morning. How I wish I had never left home. I don't know how you managed to make up your mind to come to Redmond at all, if you're really such an undecided person," said amused Priscilla. "Bless your heart, honey, I didn't. It was Father who wanted me to come here. His heart was set on it. Why, I don't know. It seems perfectly ridiculous to think of me studying for a BA degree, doesn't it? Not but what I can do it all right. I have heaps of brains." "Oh," said Priscilla vaguely. "Yes, but it's such hard work to use them. And BAs are such learned, dignified, wise, solemn creatures. They must be. No, I didn't want to come to Redmond. I did it just to oblige Father. He is such a duck. Besides, I knew if I stayed home, I'd have to get married. Mother wanted that. Wanted it decidedly. Mother has plenty of decisions, but I really hated the thought of being married for a few years yet. I want to have heaps of fun before I settle down, and ridiculous as the idea of my being a BA is, the idea of my being an old married woman is still more absurd, isn't it? I'm only 18. No. I concluded I would rather come to Redmond than be married. Besides, how could I ever have made up my mind which man to marry?" "Were there so many?" laughed Anne. Heaps. The boys like me awfully. They really do, but there were only 2 that mattered. The rest were all too young and too poor. I must marry a rich man, you know. Why must you? Honey, you couldn't imagine me being a poor man's wife, could you? I can't do a single useful thing, and I'm very extravagant. Oh no, my husband must have heaps of money. So that narrowed them down to 2, but I couldn't decide between 2 any easier than between 200. I knew perfectly well that whichever one I chose, I'd regret all my life that I hadn't married the other. Didn't you love either of them? Asked Anne, a little hesitatingly. It was not easy for her to speak to a stranger of the great mystery and transformation of love. Goodness, no. I couldn't love anybody. It isn't in me. Besides, I wouldn't want to. Being in love makes you a perfect slave, I think, and it would give a man such power to hurt you. I'd be afraid. No. Alec and Alonzo are 2 dear boys, and I like them both so much that I really don't know which I like the better. That is the trouble. Alec is the best looking, of course, and I simply couldn't marry a man who wasn't handsome. He is good-tempered, too, and has lovely curly black hair. He's rather too perfect. I don't believe I'd like a perfect husband, somebody I could never find fault with. Then why not marry Alonzo? Asked Priscilla gravely. Think of marrying a man named Alonzo. And Phil, said Phil dolefully. I don't believe I could endure it, but he has a classic nose, and it would be a comfort to have a nose in the family that could be depended on. I can't depend on mine. So far, it takes after the Gordon pattern, but I'm so afraid it will develop burn tendencies as I grow older. I examine it every day anxiously to make sure it's still Gordon. Mother was a Byrne, and has the Byrne nose in the Byrnest degree. Wait till you see it. I adore nice noses. Your nose is awfully nice, Anne Shirley. Alonzo's nose nearly turned the balance in his favor, but Alonzo? No, I couldn't decide. If I could have done as I did with the hats, stood them both up together, shut my eyes, and jabbed with a hat pin, it would have been quite easy. What did Alec and Alonzo feel like when you came away? Queried Priscilla. Oh, they still have hope. I told them they'd have to wait till I could make up my mind. They're quite willing to wait. They both worship me, you know. Meanwhile, I intend to have a good time. I expect I shall have heaps of beaux at Redmond. I can't be happy unless I have, you know. But don't you think the freshmen are fearfully homely? I saw only one really handsome fellow among them. He went away before you came. I heard his chum call him Gilbert. His chum had eyes that stuck out that far. But you're not going yet, girls. Don't go yet. I think we must, said Anne rather coldly. It's getting late and I've some work to do. But you'll both come to see me, won't you? Asked Philippa, getting up and putting an arm around each. And let me come to see you. I want to be chummy with you. I've taken such a fancy to you both, and I haven't quite disgusted you with my frivolity, have I? Not quite, laughed Anne, responding to Phil's squeeze with a return of cordiality. Because I'm not half so silly as I seem on the surface, you know. You just accept Philippa Gordon as the Lord made her with all her faults, and I believe you'll come to like her. Isn't this graveyard a sweet place? I'd love to be buried here. Here's a grave I didn't see before. This one in the iron railing. Oh, girls, look, see? The stone says it's the grave of a middy who was killed in the fight between the Shannon and the Chesapeake. Just fancy. Anne paused by the railing and looked at the worn stone, her pulses thrilling with sudden excitement. The old graveyard, with its overarching trees and long aisles of shadows, faded from her sight. Instead, she saw the Kingsport harbor of nearly a century agone. Out of the mist came slowly a great frigate, brilliant with the meteor flag of England. Behind her was another, with a still heroic form, wrapped in his own starry flag, lying on the quarterdeck, the gallant Lawrence. Time's finger had turned back his pages, and that was the Shannon sailing triumphant up the bay with the Chesapeake as her prize. Come back, Anne Shirley, come back, laughed Philippa, pulling her arm. You're 100 years away from us. Come back. Anne came back with a sigh. Her eyes were shining softly. I've always loved that story, she said, and although the English won that victory, I think it was because of the brave, defeated commander I love it. This grave seems to bring it so near and make it so real. This poor little middy was only 18. He died of desperate wounds, received in gallant action. So reads his epitaph. It is such as a soldier might wish for. Before she turned away, Anne unpinned the little cluster of purple pansies she wore and dropped it softly on the grave of the boy who had perished in the great sea duel. Well, what do you think of our new friend? Asked Priscilla when Phil had left them. I like her. There is something very lovable about her in spite of all her nonsense. I believe, as she says herself, that she isn't half as silly as she sounds. She's a dear, kissable baby, and I don't know that she'll ever really grow up. I like her too, said Priscilla decidedly. She talks as much about boys as Ruby Gillis does, but it always enrages or sickens me to hear Ruby, whereas I just wanted to laugh good-naturedly at Phil. Now, what is the why of that? There's a difference, said Anne meditatively. I think it's because Ruby is really so conscious of boys. She plays at love and love-making. Besides, you feel when she's boasting of her beaux that she is doing it to rub it well into you that you haven't half so many. Now, when Phil talks of all her beaux, it sounds as if she was speaking of chums. She really looks upon boys as a good comrades, and she is pleased when she has dozens of them tagging round, simply because she likes to be popular and to be thought popular. Even Alec and Alonzo, I'll never be able to think of those two names separately after this, are to her just two playfellows who want her to play with them all their lives. I'm glad we met her, and I'm glad we went to Old St. John's. I believe I've put forth a tiny soul root into Kingsport soil this afternoon. I hope so. I hate to feel transplanted.